You're listening to Eating for Eden, Episode 3. When it comes to doing something about climate change, your food choices matter. Thanks for tuning in to Eating for Eden, a podcast that takes a food-first approach to climate action. I'm your host, Jessica J. Schroeder, and I am passionate about food that tastes good and does good. I'll guide you with practical tips and help you thoroughly enjoy your food along the way. In recent years, it's been en vogue to eat local. Farm-to-table restaurants have popped up all over the country. The most conventional grocery stores proudly boast local produce, and even library cookbook shelves have filled up with all things locavore. It's not difficult to see why this has caught on, and for good reason. Not only does eating local reduce a person's individual carbon footprint, it also usually is more delicious and fosters a unique connectedness to place. The slow food movement, birthed out of Italy and making its way around the globe, is just one example of the good that can be done by emphasizing local food. This has been an emphasis for me in recent years as well. I supported a local CSA, or community-supported agriculture, one summer, getting a bag of vegetables grown just 1 mile from my home each week. I have frequented restaurants sourcing local ingredients. And I enjoy getting ideas from cookbooks emphasizing eating seasonally and locally. There's no question that eating a local version of a product reduces its transportation emissions. Consuming something grown 5 miles from home rather than 500 miles is a good choice. Why choose salad greens trucked in from states away if you can purchase some from a local farm stand? These are good options, and for more than just the environment. But the question is, when it comes to eating for climate change, how much does local actually matter? A lot? A little? Somewhere in between? To answer this question, we need to consider the level of impact transportation has on a food's overall footprint. It's one thing to take a, quote, common sense approach to something like this, assuming something must be the case. It's another thing to put it under the microscope, so to speak, and examine it through scientific data. Dr. Hannah Ritchie, a researcher at Our World in Data, claims that the charge to, quote, eat local is one of the most misguided pieces of advice. She goes on to clarify, saying, eating locally would only have a significant impact if transport was responsible for a large share of food's final carbon footprint. For most foods, this is not the case. To be clear, she's not saying that eating local makes no difference at all. Rather, she's emphasizing the size of the difference. This may surprise you. It certainly surprised me to learn this. But the transportation of a given food typically only accounts for less than 10% of its total carbon footprint. And it's far less than 10% for some of the biggest emitters, as we'll get to in a minute. The vast majority of a food's climate impact has to do with the various other factors specific to the food item itself, such as land use change and farming practices. Additional potential factors aside from transport include animal feed, processing, retail, and packaging. According to an article by Dr. Ritchie on this very topic, combined land use and farm stage emissions account for more than 80% of the footprint for most foods. Comparatively, she adds, transport is a small contributor to emissions. For most food products, it accounts for less than 10%. Dr. Ritchie further states, it's much smaller for the largest greenhouse gas emitters. In beef from beef herds, it's 0.5%. Taking beef from beef herds as an example then, if only 0.5% comes from transportation, then 99.5% of emissions from beef are caused by other factors, most notably farm stage emissions followed by land use change. If transportation only accounts for 0.5% of beef's emissions, does choosing local beef really make much of a difference? I realize that there are other values at play as well when considering whether to eat local. Supporting local is about relationships in the community, the local economy, and more. But from an environmental point of view, waving the local flag, so to speak, can be a bit of a distraction. Based on the science, Eating locally has a relatively small impact compared to other steps we might take. So, what would make a bigger impact? What can we do to lessen the other 90 to 99% of our food's emissions? Dr. Ritchie's conclusion is that it matters far more what we choose to eat than where that food comes from. Now, I'm the last person to tell you not to garden or to skip the local farmer's market. I think anyone who has the ability to garden should give it a try. And of course, it's wonderful to support local farmers and partake of the beauty of foods grown close to home. But sometimes I wonder if we overemphasize where our food comes from to the exclusion of appropriately considering what that food actually is. Also, I'm not proposing an either-or. Choosing to eat mostly plants and choosing to eat local are not mutually exclusive. Hopefully, we can move toward doing more of both. But it is vital that we prioritize what we eat over where it comes from. Filling your plate with a diversity of whole plants is more important and makes a greater difference than worrying about how far it traveled to make it to your plate. Let's get practical. You can make a great difference by knowing what the biggest emitters are, eating less of the biggest emitters, and eating more plants, especially plant sources of protein. Getting into each of these a bit more, first, know what the biggest emitters are. What are the biggest emitters, regardless of transportation, that it's best to cut down on or avoid altogether? For a visual of the relative climate impact of various foods and what stage of agriculture or production those emissions come from, I highly recommend you take a look at the chart provided by Our World in Data linked in the show notes. It's a powerful and highly informative image, as well as a good reference to have on hand. By far, beef from beef herds is the largest emitter, followed by lamb and mutton. Lumped together then, significantly reducing or entirely avoiding red meat is the easiest lever to pull and makes the biggest impact. Lamb has just under half the impact that beef has, and just below lamb are cheese and beef coming from dairy herds. Transportation remains a small fraction of each of these and can be seen on the chart linked in the show notes. Unfortunately, beans are not shown on this chart, but similar high-protein plant foods like soy milk, peas, and nuts are shown. Beef's emissions are over 60 times higher than each of these. Now, I don't want to merely skip over the fact that coffee and chocolate are fairly high on the list for emissions as well. They're not as high as beef, lamb, and cheese, but they're much higher than most other plant foods. I'll plan to dedicate a separate episode to these later on. So, to be continued. Also, please hear me say, it's not that we ought never to consume something that's a high emitter. I'm not saying we all need a hard and fast line in the sand, but we do need to consider the proportion of our diets relying on these high emitters. For instance, when I look at what my husband and I eat on a daily basis, the vast majority of our calories come from the bottom half of the chart. Can you say the same? Will your goal be to be able to say the same? I hope so. Second, eat less of the biggest emitters. If you only do one thing as a result of hearing this podcast, reduce your intake of red meat. In the grand scheme of things, regardless of how we raise cattle for slaughter, our global population simply has too high of a demand for beef for our planet to sustain. The biggest dent you can make in your own food-related emissions is to reduce how much red meat you eat. Even consider eliminating it from your diet entirely or saving it for very special occasions. Now, please keep in mind, bringing the truth to bear about these big emitters is not meant to require an all-or-nothing response. We each need to reckon with this data, but our responses are going to differ and may change over time as we apply it to our individual lives. While some of us may choose to give up certain foods entirely, others may choose to eat them less frequently. As a personal example, I can't recall the last time I had a bite of beef. At the same time, I do eat some small fish on occasion. Even if you don't know how far you're willing to go, choosing to reduce from where you are currently is still doing something. And remember from episode 2, don't let perfection be the enemy of the good. Let's say you eat beef 5 days a week. Reducing that number to 3 is a step in the right direction. If you eat a large portion of cheese whenever you have it, consider eating less in a sitting. Or use it only when you really notice it and fully appreciate it. For example, once I stopped putting shredded cheese on Mexican food, I found I actually didn't miss it. I realized it just got lost in all the other flavors and textures and wasn't really adding much anyway. While eating less beef certainly makes the largest dent, we can also make a difference by eating less meat in general. Pig meat and poultry have over 7 and 6 times the emissions of protein-rich plant foods, respectively. Even if you entirely omit red meat from your diet, which is terrific, if you lessen the overall meat you eat as well, you're going even further. Third, eat more plants, especially protein-rich plants. As a rule of thumb, setting aside special cases like coffee and chocolate, emphasizing plant foods is a great way to lessen your carbon footprint. The top half of the chart is primarily animal foods, while the bottom half of the chart is almost exclusively plant foods. Plus, when you consider the animal foods near the middle, the plant-based alternatives to those foods have lower emissions. The reason I emphasize protein-rich plants here is because when we decrease or entirely eliminate our intake of meat, we need to be thoughtful about where our protein is coming from. If not from beef, pork, or chicken, dairy milk, or cheese, and so forth, reach for low emitters like legumes and whole grains. Of course, it's also important and good to eat a variety of fruits, vegetables, nuts, and seeds as well. These are terrific low-emission options to fill up our plates. But given the emphasis here on meat and dairy, which pack a protein punch, it's good to be aware of good sources of a low-emission plant-based protein. Options include a wide variety of whole legumes and minimally processed soy products. Think black beans, refried beans, chickpeas, lentils, black-eyed peas, butter beans, Great Northern beans, split peas, edamame, tofu, tempeh, and so many more. And that's not even to mention nuts and seeds, which have a huge variety. There's a tremendous variety of these protein and fiber-rich gems, and there are so many delightful ways to prepare them. I hope you'll give them a try as you make swaps and reduce your meat and dairy intakes. To wrap things up, it matters far more what we choose to eat than where that food comes from. While I hope you can enjoy local, seasonal produce and support the farmers nearby your home, don't be fooled by claims like local grass-fed beef being a better choice than black beans or tofu, even if the latter came from across the globe. I hope you feel empowered to make informed decisions as you shop, meal plan, prepare, and enjoy your meals. You can make a difference. Each choice you make is a vote for something. But don't fear making the wrong decision. Take what you know now and move forward, one little step at a time. Start where you are, do what you can, and build from there. Thanks for listening to Eating for Eden. If you found this episode informative or inspiring, please consider sharing it with a friend. Climate change is an issue we all need to tackle together, so let's invite others to journey along with us as we continue the conversation and start taking action. Until next week, friends, take care.